Before the gunshots at Lexington, before independence was even a dream, America was a world defined by contrasts, by prosperity and hardship, freedom and oppression, opportunity and inequality. It was a society in transition, caught between the traditions of Europe and the possibilities of a new world. To understand why the American Revolution erupted with such force, we must first step inside this world, a world where 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast, bustling with life, ideas, ambition, and tension. Life before the Revolution was not quiet. It was complicated, vibrant, and increasingly restless. In the mid-1700s, nearly 2.5 million people lived in British North America. Most were clustered along the coast or near navigable rivers, where ports, farms, and small towns formed the backbone of colonial society. The colonies were not identical. Each region carried its own rhythms and identity. New England, shaped by rocky soil and Puritan traditions, was a land of small farms, tight-knit towns, and a culture that valued literacy, community responsibility, and religious discipline. The middle colonies, often called the breadbasket, were defined by fertile lands, cultural diversity, and thriving markets. The southern colonies, dominated by plantations, relied heavily on enslaved African labor to grow tobacco, rice, and indigo, crops that built enormous wealth for a small elite while trapping thousands in bondage. Yet for all their differences, the colonies shared a sense of growing distance from Britain. Most colonists rarely saw a British soldier, never visited London, and lived lives that looked nothing like those of people in England. They were proud to call themselves British, but increasingly confident in their own identity, American, though the word was not yet boldly claimed. Daily life varied sharply depending on who you were. For most white colonists, the day began with the rising sun. Farmers managed fields, livestock, and the endless work that sustained their households. In homes lit by candles and warmed by hearth fires, families cooked meals of corn mush, salted meat, bread, and seasonal vegetables. Women were the center of household production, spinning thread, making clothes, preparing food, tending gardens, and raising children in a world without modern conveniences. Children worked young, collecting firewood, milking cows, grinding grain, and learning skills vital for survival. For townspeople, life revolved around trades. Blacksmiths hammered out tools, carpenters shaped wood into furniture and homes, printers produced pamphlets and newspapers that connected the colonies. Taverns served as the heart of public life, places where merchants negotiated deals, travelers exchanged stories, and common people debated politics, often loudly, often heatedly. Taverns were, in many ways, the birthplace of revolutionary ideas. Education was valued but uneven. In New England, many boys, and some girls, learned to read the Bible. In the South, wealthy planters hired private tutors while poorer families often went without formal schooling. Despite regional differences, the colonies were among the most literate places in the world, a fact that would later help revolutionary ideas spread like wildfire. Religious life shaped community identity. The colonies were far more religiously diverse than England itself. Puritans, Anglicans, Quakers, Baptists, Presbyterians, Lutherans, all coexisted, sometimes peacefully, sometimes in rivalry. The Great Awakening, a wave of religious revival sweeping the colonies in the 1730s, 1740s, inspired fiery sermons that challenged established authority. Preachers like George Whitefield moved crowds of thousands, urging ordinary people to question spiritual, and eventually political, hierarchies. This awakening planted seeds of independence long before anyone spoke of revolution. But to understand colonial America fully, we must face its harsh realities. The prosperity enjoyed by many was built on the backs of others. Enslaved Africans, numbering nearly 500,000 by the 1770s, lived under brutal conditions, forced labor, violence, and families torn apart. They built plantations, harvested crops, cooked, cleaned, and shaped every corner of colonial life, yet their stories were rarely written down. For them, America was not a land of liberty, it was a system of bondage with no promise of freedom in sight. Indigenous peoples, too, lived with constant pressure as colonists expanded westward. Tribes such as the Iroquois, Shawnee, Cherokee, and Powhatan navigated diplomacy, warfare, trade, and uneasy coexistence with the colonists. While some alliances formed, conflict was persistent. Many native nations faced displacement, disease, and betrayal as colonial settlements grew. Yet indigenous societies were sophisticated, politically complex, and deeply rooted in the land, an America long in existence before Europeans arrived. Economically, the colonies were thriving, but their prosperity was tied to the British imperial system. Trade laws, known as the Navigation Acts, required colonists to ship goods on British vessels and sell certain products only to Britain. Smuggling was widespread. Merchants often saw these laws as barriers to opportunity. For Britain, the colonies were sources of wealth. For many colonists, the restrictions felt increasingly unfair. Still, in the decades before the Revolution, most people lived without imagining they might one day break from the British crown. Newspapers carried more local concerns than global politics. Court records dealt with disputes over land boundaries, debts, and livestock wandering into neighbors' fields. Many colonists worked sunup to sundown, concerned more with harvests, weather, and survival than with imperial policy. Yet beneath the surface, something was changing. The colonies were growing more confident, more assertive. Their populations boomed, their economies diversified, and their cultural identity strengthened. A young generation emerged that had never seen England, never felt governed by the king in any personal way, and never truly believed that distant rulers understood life across the Atlantic. Tensions rose after the French and Indian War ended in 1763, reshaping the relationship between Britain and the colonies. Britain, deeply in debt, began imposing taxes and enforcing trade restrictions with new intensity. Colonists who had once enjoyed relative autonomy suddenly found themselves confronted by British soldiers, new laws, and direct imperial oversight. The Stamp Act, Sugar Act, Quartering Act, each created outrage, protest, and a growing sense that colonial rights were under threat. But before rebellion could erupt, colonial society had to reach a turning point, an awakening, a shift in perception. That shift began in the everyday experiences of farmers, merchants, artisans, enslaved people, and indigenous nations. Life before the Revolution was a complex tapestry of hope, fear, tradition, and change. It was in these homes, fields, workshops, and meeting houses that the seeds of independence were planted, not by a single event, but by decades of evolving identity. The colonies were becoming something new, not merely extensions of Britain, but a society with its own character, contradictions, and ambitions. As we move deeper into this story, we will explore how this world, diverse, dynamic, and often divided, set the stage for a revolution that would reshape history. To understand the world that stood on the edge of revolution, we must step deeper into the rhythms of daily life, into the work people did, the wealth they pursued, and the deep inequalities that shaped their society. Colonial America was a land of ambition, yet also a land divided by class, race, and region. From the bustling ports of Boston to the tobacco fields of Virginia plantations of South Carolina, the pursuit of opportunity defined life, but so did the limited it. In the 18th century, the economy of the colonies was expanding rapidly, fueling both prosperity and tension. Part of the vast British mercantile system, a global web of trade linking Europe, Africa, the Caribbean, and North America. Ships moved the Atlantic, carrying goods that shaped life in every region. Timber, furs, wheat, fish, and rice flowed out of American ports. Manufactured goods, like enslaved Africans, flowed in. Markets boomed, towns expanded, and forged, not only by the wealthy but also by skilled artisans and merchants who found new opportunities in the growing colonial economy. The largest city in British North America, crowded with ships from Britain, the Caribbean, and Europe. Merchants tallied accounts in warehouses stacked with crates of sugar, and bundles of imported cloth. Carpenters, coopers, silversmiths, rope makers, and shipbuilders filled the workshops that lined the narrow streets. Newspapers described Philadelphia as the Athens of America, a place of learning, conversation, and ambition. Farther north, Boston remained a center of maritime trade. The economy revolved around fishing, shipbuilding, and commerce. Families worked in small shops or on the waterfront. Fishermen braved the icy waters of the North Atlantic and forged the tools and goods needed for daily politics. Taverns buzzed with talk about tax officials and rising prices. Conversation ignite revolutionary sparks. In New York, Dutch and English entered into a city defined by trade, diversity, and rivalry. Wealthy families like the Livingstons competed for political power. Immigrants arrived constantly, Scots, Irish, Dutch, Sephardic Jews, mix of languages and customs. Markets overflowed with goods from across the Atlantic world. Yet beneath the prosperity, tension simmered. Enslaved Africans made up nearly one population, their labor essential but their freedoms brutally restricted. But to grasp the full picture of pre-revolution America, we must move beyond the cities and into the vast stretches of countryside where most colonists lived. Agriculture was the backbone of colonial life. Roughly 9 out of 10 colonists, white and free, worked the land. But not all farms were equal. In New England, rocky soil meant small farms with modest output. Families grew enough to survive and traded surplus goods locally. Community cooperation was essential. Neighbors exchanged labor, tools, and help during harvest season. Town meetings allowed ordinary people a voice in local government, an experience that nurtured habits of self-rule. In the middle colonies, fertile soil and moderate climate created large, productive farms. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye were grown in abundance. These colonies became the breadbasket of North America, feeding not just themselves but also Caribbean plantations and European markets. Rural communities were diverse. Germans introduced advanced farming techniques, Scots-Irish settlers carved out new frontier towns, Quakers promoted peaceful coexistence and equality, at least among those they considered equals. But the greatest wealth, and the greatest cruelty, lay in the South. Plantation economies dominated Virginia, Maryland, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Tobacco ruled the Chesapeake region, rice and indigo flourished in the lower South. These crops required labor, relentless, back-breaking labor. And that labor came primarily from enslaved Africans. By the 1770s, enslaved people made up more than 40% of the population in the lower South. On some plantations, they outnumbered whites 10-1. Plantation life was a world defined by extremes. At the top stood wealthy planters, men who controlled thousands of acres, hundreds of enslaved workers, and vast political power. Many modeled their lives on English aristocrats, building grand houses, collecting imported furniture, and educating their sons in Europe. At the bottom were enslaved people, whose daily lives were defined by violence, exploitation, and dehumanization. They labored under the burning sun, planting, cutting, drying, and packing crops that generated wealth they would never share. Families were torn apart by sale, punishments were brutal, rights were non-existent. Yet even in these harsh conditions, enslaved people forged communities, preserved African traditions, practiced their faiths, and resisted in ways big and small, running away, sabotaging work, maintaining cultural identity, and seeking freedom whenever opportunities emerged. Their experiences were a central, painful part of life in colonial America. Between the wealthy elite and the enslaved laborers existed a broad middle class of artisans, small farmers, shopkeepers, and tradespeople. Many lived modest but stable lives. They were the backbone of colonial society, the ones who crowded into churches on Sundays, filled militia ranks, attended town meetings, and debated local and imperial politics. They cared deeply about rights, property, and fairness. As taxes and British oversight increased in the 1760s and 1770s, it was this group that became increasingly vocal. Below them were indentured servants, men and women who came to America seeking opportunity but were bound to labor for several years to repay their passage. Many suffered abuse or harsh working conditions. Some earned land after their contracts ended, but many did not, joining the ranks of the poor. On the frontier, life was even harder. Families carved farms out of wilderness, constantly facing shortages, isolation, and conflict with native nations who defended their homelands. Despite these inequalities, one idea united many colonists: the belief that America was a land where people could rise, where hard work could bring independence and ownership. This belief was not true for everyone, not for enslaved Africans, not for most indigenous peoples, but it shaped white colonial identity. Land was abundant, labor was in demand, and opportunities seemed greater than in Europe, where class barriers were rigid. Still, wealth in the colonies was more unequal than many realize. A small percentage of men controlled the majority of property, political offices, and economic power. Cities had growing populations of poor laborers who struggled to find stable work and could not afford rising prices. In the countryside, tenant farmers worked land owned by wealthy landlords, paying rent in crops or cash. Inequality created resentment, tension, and, eventually, revolutionary energy. As Britain tightened control over colonial trade and imposed new taxes, class divisions took on new meaning. Merchants protested restrictions. Artisans feared losing economic independence. Farmers resisted debt and land seizures. Enslaved people hoped upheaval might bring freedom. Indigenous nations watched carefully, unsure whether conflict between Britain and the colonies would lead to opportunities or new dangers. America before the Revolution was not simply a world waiting for independence, it was a world already in motion, growing, changing, and straining under the pressures of inequality and ambition. The people who would soon demand liberty lived in a society that denied liberty to many. Their daily work, their desires, and their struggles shaped the ideas that would lead to revolution. As the cries of rights and liberty grew louder, every class, region, and community felt the tremors of change. The stage was set. The world was shifting. And soon, the colonies would begin to question not just taxes or trade laws, but the very structure of their society. To understand why the American colonies ultimately rebelled, we must explore not only their daily life and economy, but also the political world they lived in, the system of government, justice, and public debate that shaped their expectations and frustrations. Colonial America was not a land without structure. It had courts, laws, elected assemblies, and long political traditions inherited from England. But over time, these structures created an identity, a sense of autonomy, and a set of expectations that increasingly clashed with British authority. Life before the Revolution was shaped by political habits that made rebellion not only possible, but almost inevitable. The colonies were governed under charters granted by the British Crown, but every colony had its own political personality. Some were royal colonies with governors appointed by the king, others were proprietary or corporate colonies with more local control. Yet across all 13, a common pattern emerged: colonial assemblies, bodies elected by landowning white men, became the center of local power. These assemblies controlled taxes, public spending, and local laws. They reflected the will of the colony far more closely than distant British officials ever could. For many colonists, this experience was formative. They grew up seeing neighbors debate politics in town meetings, voting for representatives, and challenging governors when decisions felt unjust. The idea that people had a voice in government was not abstract, it was lived reality. This early form of participatory politics planted seeds of independence long before talk of rebellion began. Still, power was not balanced. Royal governors technically held great authority. They could veto laws, command militias, and enforce imperial policy. But practically, their power was limited. Colonists controlled salaries. If a governor angered an assembly, legislators could simply withhold his pay. This tug-of-war created friction and resentment on both sides. Governors complained that colonists were stubborn and disobedient. Colonists accused governors of arrogance and overreach. This tension grew sharper as the colonies expanded. By the mid-1700s, many colonists resented British interference in their affairs. They believed government should be close, local, and responsive. They saw the assemblies as protectors of their rights, rights they believed were inherited from English traditions. The idea of the rights of Englishmen pulsed through colonial political life. These included the right to trial by jury, protection from arbitrary arrest, and the expectation that taxes should only be imposed with consent. Colonists believed deeply in these rights, perhaps more passionately than most people actually living in England. Courts also played a major role in shaping political consciousness. Colonial courts were public arenas, places where ordinary people watched disputes unfold. Courtrooms featured farmers suing neighbors over property lines, merchants battling over debts, and enslaved people facing brutal punishments under laws designed to control them. The courts taught colonists how power worked, how justice was delivered, and how the law could be used or abused. In many regions, lawyers became prominent figures. Men like John Adams, Patrick Henry, and James Otis built reputations defending clients against what they saw as unjust policies. Their arguments, grounded in natural rights, property rights, and the limits of government power, helped shape the language of the Revolution. Colonial lawyers were not merely legal practitioners, they were architects of political ideology. But politics was not limited to courtrooms or assemblies. It lived in the streets, in taverns, in churches, and especially in newspapers. The colonies had an unusually vibrant print culture. Dozens of newspapers circulated weekly, spreading news, opinion essays, and fiery debates. A literate population devoured this printed material eagerly. The press gave colonists a shared political language, connecting towns separated by hundreds of miles. Essays, sometimes written anonymously, challenged the decisions of governors, questioned British policies, and urged readers to protect their freedoms. Newspapers became battlegrounds where political ideas were tested and sharpened. When Britain introduced new taxes in the 1760s, the press exploded with protest. Writers invoked history, philosophy, and English legal tradition to argue that Parliament had no right to tax the colonies without representation. These debates did not create political consciousness, they amplified what years of self-governance had already seeded. Religion, too, influenced political awareness. The Great Awakening, with its emphasis on personal choice, moral responsibility, and skepticism of established authority, prepared colonists to question political leaders as well. Preachers who urged individuals to seek spiritual truth without relying on official church structures unintentionally taught people to challenge political authority too. In many ways, the pulpit helped prepare the colony for revolution long before the musket did. Yet it is impossible to understand colonial political life without acknowledging who was excluded. Women had no political rights, though many were politically aware. They read newspapers, discussed issues at home, and participated in boycotts. Enslaved Africans were barred entirely from political participation. Indigenous nations had their own political systems, sophisticated and deeply rooted, but these were ignored or dismissed by colonists. Political power was mostly in the hands of white male property owners, who defined the terms of rights and governance. Still, even within those boundaries, the colonies developed a culture of political engagement unmatched in most of the world. Public life was lively, fiercely debated, and deeply valued. When Britain began tightening control after the French and Indian War, colonists did not passively accept these changes. They questioned, argued, resisted, and organized. Political awareness turned into political action. By the early 1760s, Britain sought revenue from the colonies to pay war debts. The Sugar Act, Stamp Act, and Townshend Acts introduced new taxes and stricter enforcement. For colonists, this felt like a direct attack on self-rule. They believed only their own assemblies had the right to tax them. No taxation without representation was not merely a slogan, it was the natural extension of decades of political experience. Protests erupted. Crowds gathered in streets, burned effigies, and intimidated tax collectors. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Committees of correspondence linked towns and colonies, spreading news and coordinating responses. Ordinary men and women joined the fight, refusing to buy imported goods, making their own cloth, and publicly shaming those who violated boycotts. Meanwhile, across the frontier, other political struggles unfolded. Indigenous nations negotiated with colonial governments, balanced alliances, and defended their lands against encroachment. The Proclamation Line of 1763, intended to prevent conflict by restricting colonial settlement west of the Appalachians, angered frontier settlers who believed they had earned the right to the land through blood and labor. The line worsened tensions between frontiersmen and British officials, adding yet another thread to the growing tapestry of resentment. Life before the Revolution was not peaceful, it was politically charged. Colonists lived in a world where they believed they had rights, believed they had a voice, and believed they had earned autonomy through generations of self-governance. The more Britain tried to assert control, the more colonists felt their political identity threatened. By the 1770s, a profound shift had occurred. What began as protests against taxes had grown into a larger question: who had the right to rule? Could a people who had governed themselves for decades truly accept distant authority? Could a society that valued representation tolerate decisions made across an ocean? The answer, increasingly, was no. The political world of pre-revolution America was a world awakening to itself, confident, assertive, and increasingly unwilling to accept British rule. Rebellion was still years away, but its foundations had already been built in the hearts and minds of ordinary colonists who had learned to think politically, argue passionately, and defend their rights. Life in America before the Revolution cannot be understood only through economics or politics. To truly step inside this world, we must explore the culture, traditions, beliefs, and social interactions that shaped how people saw themselves and their communities. Colonial America was not a uniform society. It was a mosaic, diverse in religion, language, customs, and identity. Yet beneath that diversity, a new shared culture was forming, one that would eventually help unite 13 very different colonies. At the heart of colonial culture was community. No matter where one lived, New England villages, middle colony towns, or southern plantations, people depended on each other for survival. Families were large, extended, and interconnected by marriage and tradition. Neighbors helped build barns, harvest crops, and care for the sick. Social life revolved around the rhythms of the year, planting, harvesting, religious festivals, and market days. In New England, towns were compact and organized around a central meeting house, which served both as a church and a political hall. Families walked to services each Sunday, enduring long sermons that reinforced religious devotion and community duty. Education was highly valued. Many children learned to read so they could study the Bible. New England's Puritan heritage shaped a culture of discipline, morality, and intellectual seriousness, but also one of community involvement and debate. The middle colonies, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware, were the most diverse region in America. Dutch merchants, English farmers, German craftsmen, Scots-Irish frontiersmen, enslaved Africans, and Jewish communities lived side by side. This mixture created a culture of tolerance, negotiation, and economic collaboration. Markets were lively, filled with goods from around the Atlantic world. Holiday celebrations were colorful, German Christmas traditions, Dutch New Year feasts, Quaker gatherings, and African festivals blended into a rich cultural tapestry. In the South, society revolved around plantations, which were often isolated and self-sufficient. Social gatherings took place at parish churches, court days, and the homes of wealthy planters. Southern elites cultivated an image of gentility, modeled on British aristocracy. They hosted lavish dinners, imported fine clothing, and educated their sons abroad. Yet beneath this polished surface was the immense suffering of enslaved Africans whose labor sustained the plantation lifestyle. Enslaved communities preserved cultural traditions that connected them to their African roots. Music, rhythm, storytelling, dance, and spiritual practices became essential forms of resilience. Songs carried hidden meanings, stories of trickster heroes taught survival, religious gatherings provided hope. Despite brutal oppression, enslaved people forged cultural identities that profoundly shaped Southern life, and, eventually, American culture as a whole. Across all regions, food reflected the land and its diversity. Colonists ate corn, squash, beans, venison, and fish, foods rooted in indigenous agriculture and hunting traditions. European colonists brought wheat, cattle, pigs, and dairy. Africans introduced okra, rice-growing techniques, and spices that transformed Southern cuisine. Meals were hearty and practical: stews, baked bread, salted meats, pottages, pies, and seasonal vegetables. On the frontier, families relied heavily on hunting, foraging, and preserving food to survive long winters. Clothing varied with class and region. Wealthy colonists imported silk, linen, and fine wool. Artisans and farmers wore homespun garments made from flax and wool. Women were skilled in spinning, weaving, and sewing. Clothing was durable and often passed down through families. In cities, fashion followed trends from London, updated by ships that carried new styles every season. Social life was full of gatherings, weddings, funerals, barn raisings, festivals, and seasonal celebrations. In New England, town meetings were major events where men debated taxes, schools, roads, and community disputes. In the middle colonies, markets and fairs brought together diverse groups. In the South, court days, when judges traveled from town to town, became social and economic hubs. Taverns played a crucial role in colonial culture. They were the center of public life, places where travelers rested, merchants negotiated deals, farmers shared news, and political debates erupted over mugs of cider or rum. Taverns served as informal town halls, newsrooms, and political clubs. Many revolutionary ideas were first discussed not in assembly halls but in smoky tavern rooms filled with laughter, arguments, and the clatter of tankards. Education, too, shaped colonial identity. The colonies were surprisingly literate compared to much of the world. In New England, public schools were common, supported by community taxes. In the middle colonies, private academies and religious schools flourished. In the South, education varied widely. Wealthy families hired tutors, while many poor whites and enslaved Africans received no schooling at all. Still, printed materials circulated everywhere: newspapers, almanacs, pamphlets, and books. Almanacs were especially popular. Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac was a bestseller filled with weather predictions, practical advice, and witty sayings. Colonists relied on almanacs to plan planting, predict storms, and entertain families on winter nights. Technology was simple by modern standards, yet innovation was constant. Mills ground grain, forges produced tools, water wheels powered sawmills and ironworks. Colonial craftsmen were skilled and adaptable: blacksmiths, coopers, cabinet makers, cobblers, gunsmiths, and printers kept the economy moving. Many crafts were passed down through generations, and apprenticeships shaped the future workforce. On the frontier, stretching from the Appalachians into new territories, life was harsh, unpredictable, and often violent. Settlers built cabins, cleared forests, and defended themselves from threats. For indigenous nations, frontier expansion brought displacement, broken treaties, and conflict. Yet native communities maintained strong political structures, vibrant cultures, and deep spiritual connections to their homelands, resisting colonial encroachment through diplomacy and warfare. Religion remained a unifying and dividing force. Churches were central to community identity. Sermons addressed moral behavior, social order, and sometimes political issues. The Great Awakening had encouraged emotional expression and spiritual equality, challenging old hierarchies. People began to believe not only in personal salvation but also in personal responsibility for society. Ideas of equality before God subtly nurtured ideas of equality in government. Gender roles were strict but evolving. Women managed households, raised children, made clothing, prepared food, tended gardens, and supported family businesses. Though they lacked formal political rights, they were active participants in community life and crucial to survival. As tensions with Britain grew, women became political actors through boycotts, spinning bees, and economic independence that challenged British imports. Recreation and entertainment provided relief from daily labor. Colonists enjoyed music, dancing, storytelling, card games, horse races, and theatrical performances, especially in the cities and the South. Children played with wooden toys, marbles, dolls, and games passed down from Europe. Winter evenings were filled with stories told by firelight, some rooted in European folklore, others drawn from native or African traditions. Despite cultural richness, colonial society was marked by inequalities. Enslaved Africans faced relentless brutality with no legal protections. Indigenous nations were pushed from their lands. Poor families struggled with hunger, disease, and lack of opportunity. Women had limited legal rights. These injustices shaped colonial life as much as prosperity and freedom did. Yet within this complex world, something new was taking shape: a shared colonial culture. Newspapers, trade, travel, and intercolonial communication began weaving the 13 colonies together. People increasingly saw themselves not just as Virginians, New Yorkers, or Bostonians, but as part of a broader American society. Distinct accents, foods, customs, and political habits created an emerging identity that set them apart from Britain. By the 1760s and 1770s, cultural networks made it easier for revolutionary ideas to spread. Sermons carried political messages. Newspapers reprinted articles from other colonies. Travelers brought news of protests, taxes, and British actions. Ordinary people discussed politics in their daily routines, from farmers at markets to sailors on docks, from enslaved workers in kitchens to merchants in counting houses. Colonial culture, shaped by diversity, cooperation, conflict, and shared experience, was reaching a turning point. A society once tied to British traditions was becoming something different, something new. The people of America were no longer just subjects of the crown, they were members of communities that valued independence, debate, opportunity, and self-governance. Everyday life in the colonies had prepared them for revolution long before the first shot was fired. The habits of cooperation, the networks of communication, the traditions of self-rule, and the shared cultural identity all created a society ready to imagine a future beyond empire. By the early 1770s, life in the American colonies was suspended between two worlds, the familiar order that had governed everyday existence for generations, and an emerging feeling that this order was no longer sustainable. The British Empire still towered over the colonies, its laws, traditions, and military presence shaping daily life. Yet beneath that appearance of stability, cracks were widening, cracks created by resentment, uncertainty, and the lived experience of ordinary people who quietly sensed that their world had changed forever. The revolution had not yet begun, but by this point, the possibility of returning to the old harmony had all but vanished. Everyday life was still dominated by farms, family rhythms, and the small rituals that brought communities together. But now, every aspect of ordinary existence felt touched by politics. When a farmer bought nails, a woman purchased imported cloth, or a merchant unloaded barrels of tea, each transaction carried with it a question of loyalty. Even the most basic household items, sugar, salt, paper, fabric, had become symbols. Many colonists found themselves trapped between necessity and principle. Should they boycott British goods as a stand against unfair taxation, or continue purchasing supplies essential for survival? This tug-of-war meant that politics now lived inside kitchens, workshops, and general stores. Newspapers played an enormous role in shaping colonial life during these final years before the war. There were more than 30 active papers spread across the colonies, each one filled with fiery editorials, letters from concerned citizens, and reprinted speeches from British Parliament. For many Americans, reading the newspaper became a daily ritual. People met in taverns to debate articles, shouting across wooden tables crowded with mugs of ale. Printers became local celebrities, their shops buzzing with the constant crack of the press and the sharp scent of ink. These papers gave ordinary colonists a power they had never possessed before, the ability to shape public opinion. But this new power also deepened divisions, turning disagreements into full-fledged ideological battles. Taverns became the informal parliaments of the colonies. These were more than drinking houses, they were meeting halls, message centers, social hubs, and political battlegrounds. On any given night, a tavern in Boston, Philadelphia, or Charleston might be filled with farmers debating taxes, merchants discussing trade embargoes, sailors swapping rumors about British ships, or local leaders plotting resistance. Taverns were also where news traveled fastest. When a British soldier insulted a colonist, or when a new law was debated in London, the story reached taverns within hours, sparking lively arguments and sometimes violent confrontations. As tensions rose, these places became breeding grounds for resistance, fueling the growing sense that British authority was no longer welcome. Yet for many people, farmers, artisans, widows, indentured servants, these political storms were overwhelming. Large numbers of colonists simply wanted to live quietly, raise their children, and avoid conflict. They had no desire to challenge the world's most powerful empire. To them, rebellion seemed reckless, dangerous, and likely to end in ruin. These were the Loyalists, though many did not yet call themselves that. They had grown up believing that British rule brought stability, prosperity, and protection. They feared that rebellion would unleash chaos, bringing violence into their towns and destroying the fragile peace they depended on. The presence of these loyalists made the pre-revolution years more complex than simple patriot heroism. Everyday life was a negotiation, between neighbors, friends, business partners, each uncertain about the path forward. Slavery, meanwhile, remained woven deeply into the fabric of colonial society, especially in the South. Enslaved men and women continued to labor on plantations, living under oppressive conditions that contrasted sharply with the colonists' growing rhetoric of liberty and rights. These contradictions were impossible to ignore. As white colonists complained about being enslaved by British taxes, enslaved Africans measured their words with silent disbelief. Yet in these final years before the Revolution, enslaved people also began to sense an opening, an instability in the old order. Some escaped. Others listened to talk of liberty and wondered whether these ideals might one day apply to them. The everyday cruelty of slavery stood in stark contrast to the political ideals that were gaining momentum, an unresolved contradiction that would haunt America long after independence. Native American nations were also watching the colonies with growing concern. For decades, settlers had pushed deeper into their lands, often breaking treaties and ignoring boundaries. Now, as colonial defiance grew, Native communities faced a dangerous dilemma. Should they support the British, who promised to restrict settler expansion? Or should they support the colonists, who were fighting for independence but were likely to demand more land afterward? Life in the borderlands became increasingly tense. Rumors of war spread through villages, and many Native leaders understood that whatever happened, their world was under threat. The revolution would not simply be a conflict between colonists and Britain, it would reshape the entire continent. The British military presence was another constant reminder that the colonies were no longer just agricultural societies but contested spaces. Redcoats patrolled streets, guarded customs houses, and enforced regulations. They lived inside colonial towns, often housed in private homes or public buildings. Their presence fueled both irritation and fear. Some colonists saw them as protectors, while others saw them as invaders enforcing policies they had never agreed to. Markets, ports, and even churches felt the pressure of this militarized atmosphere. Confrontations became more frequent, an accidental shove, a crude remark, or the refusal to pay for goods could lead to riots. Colonists who once believed violence was unthinkable now considered it a possibility. By 1774, everyday life across the colonies felt heavy, unsettled, and divided. The First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia, bringing together representatives from nearly every colony. But while leaders debated rights and governance, ordinary Americans carried the weight of uncertainty. Farmers wondered whether their fields would soon become battlefields. Merchants feared their businesses would collapse. Parents worried about their children being swept into a conflict they did not understand. Each new law, each new British response, tightened the pressure. Despite this anxiety, there was also an unmistakable new confidence growing among the colonists. They had begun forming militias, producing their own goods, and imagining a future not tied to the crown. Committees of correspondence spread information more rapidly than ever before, linking distant towns into a single political network. People who had rarely traveled beyond their own county now felt connected to a shared cause. It was this feeling, more than anger, more than resistance, that signaled the old order was collapsing. A new American identity was quietly taking shape. By the eve of revolution, colonial life had transformed beyond recognition. What had once been a world defined by agriculture, tradition, and local concerns had become a society electrified by political urgency. The colonies had not yet declared independence, but psychologically and culturally, the journey had already begun. The daily rhythms of pre-revolutionary America, harvesting wheat, printing newspapers, bartering at local markets, meeting in taverns, were now infused with a sense of destiny. Ordinary people stood on the edge of a historical turning point, unsure of the future but convinced that the world they had known was ending. The stage was set. The old order had cracked. And soon, America would cross the threshold into revolution.